what we're going to go through here is what is a solution, because most of this topic is going to be where you work with solutions. And it's sort of a recap of Year 9 stuff, but if you do have any questions, please do ask them during the video, because this is for you guys for your revision. So what I've got here is a solution of iron sulfate. So what does that actually mean? I've also got a solution here called barium nitrate. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that I've got a solid of those things. They're called ionic compounds. You don't need to remember that. But I've got some iron sulfate and I've put it in water and it's made a solution. And what a solution looks like, it's see-through because it's got no bits of solid floating in it anymore. The solid's actually broken up and has water particles in between them. I'll draw that up on the whiteboard later for you guys, so when I photograph the whiteboard you'll have a picture of that, okay? As well as those keywords that we're going to go through. What I'm going to show you quickly today is the difference between a solution and a suspension. And then I'm going to quickly show you what a precipitation reaction is. So I hope this will be a nice, quick experiment. We're going to use water as our solvent for all of these. Alright, so the solvent is the liquid that we use to try to dissolve things. If the dissolving is successful, it's a solution. If the dissolving is unsuccessful, we call it a suspension. If it's successful, we say the stuff that we put in, the powder we put in, is soluble. If we say that it doesn't dissolve, so makes a suspension, we call it insoluble. So that's covered a lot of our keywords up on the board for you already. So if you weren't sure, you can check this video again later. Okay, I'm going to start with a pretty boring one. I'm going to have some magnesium sulfate. And the reason it's boring you'll see in a moment. How would we describe that solid? What does it look like?
Salt.
It looks like salt, yeah, good. So that's an everyday thing that we've met that it looks like. Let's be really, really basic with our descriptions. What colour is it? White. And if it's a salt, we call it a crystal. So that is actually a type of salt, you're quite right. So good observation. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this salt, which is the right word, I'm going to put the salt, this white salt, into a test tube. So this is what we call our solute, the stuff that we put in. And now I'm going to add water, our solvent, to it. And give it a pretty good shake. I might have put too much of the salt in there, but we'll see. No, it looks pretty good actually. And that solid has disappeared. What colour is this here? It's the same colour as what? Water, which means the word we use is colourless. Because there's no solid bits floating around it, we know it's a solution. So this is a colourless solution. So just like this one here, barium nitrate, which is also a colourless solution. It means if you see something that looks like water, it doesn't mean it's necessarily water. You wouldn't drink either of those, they're both poisonous. Okay, well, magnesium sulfate not so, but definitely barium nitrate. So here we have a solution because the solid, the salt, disappeared in the solvent. Okay, let's have a look at a different one because that was pretty lame and boring, to be honest. What we're going to look at next is copper chloride. So that means we've got copper chloride crystals in the spatula. I won't use quite so much because it's not quite as soluble as the other one. How would we describe this one? What does it look like?
Turquoise.
Yeah, turquoise, good description. So it's sort of a greeny, bluey, or bluey, greeny salt, isn't it? It looks a bit like salt with colour, with food colouring in it, doesn't it? Is that a fair comment? Yeah. Cool, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens when I add that to water. So we've got a sort of greeny salt, a greeny crystal. Okay. Again, into my test tube. And going to use water as my solvent and see if it will dissolve. And you'll see why I didn't put so much in it because I knew it wasn't quite the same solubility. Now this is interesting. It started off green, didn't it? What colour is it now? Blue. Can you see any solid bits floating in it anymore?
No.
One or two maybe if you looked closely enough, but not nearly as many. So basically no. So again, it's made a solution because it's see-through, or what we call clear. We can see through it. So we know it's a solution. But now we can, rather than colourless like this one is quite obviously a blue solution. Cool? Right. You should be able to predict what's going to happen with this one. This one is another copper thing called copper carbonate. And this one I don't think looks like salt. I think it looks like something else.
Blue flour.
Blue flour, yeah. And so flour and this are what we call a powder. All right. So rather than being a crystal looking like salt, if it looks a bit like flour, we call it a powder. I'm going to put that powder in here, and again we're going to do the same thing. So we're doing a bit of a, not really a fair test, but we're keeping our method the same, and see what happens when I add water to that. Okay, well, could you see through that easily?
No.
How would you describe that?
Murky.
Murky and blue. It's blue like this one, but it's murky. We can use words like that, that's fine. When it goes murky, that means that there's lots of little solid bits, too small for us to see each bit, but it's not dissolved, it's insoluble. So that powder has just been spread throughout. If I leave it long enough, the top will be colourless, okay, it'll just be water, and the bottom will have that blue powder just sitting there. So I'm going to leave that during the period. You can make sure I'm not lying to you later. So the reason I want to show you that is this is what we call a suspension. I added a solid and a liquid and it didn't dissolve. So we call it a suspension. The last thing I want to show you is what happens if I mix two solutions together. So I've got barium nitrate, which I would describe as a what colour?
Colourless.
Well done, a colourless solution. So this is made by putting barium nitrate crystals into water. I'm going to have some iron sulfate solution, which is a very pale yellow solution. So it's made by putting iron sulfate crystals into water and they dissolved. But if I combine the two together, and I'm hoping this will show easily on the video, it goes murky, doesn't it? So I started with two solutions, but I ended up with a suspension. Whenever you add two solutions together and it makes a suspension, we call this a precipitation reaction. And that's what this week is about, learning about which reactions make precipitates and which ones don't. And that will be part of an assessment later in the year, or later in the term. We have to say, oh, I reckon a precipitate will form because. Okay, and I'll help you with those reasons. So let's just go through it again. We have a colourless solution made by putting a crystal into water that dissolved. A coloured solution by putting a crystal or a salt into water that did dissolve and had a colour to it. We have got a suspension, you can see it's starting to settle out already, where I put a solid into some water and it didn't dissolve, it was insoluble. And we have a precipitate, which is formed by adding two solutions together and it ended up making a suspension. So we give it a slightly different name, precipitation. Okay, and that's what you're going to be learning about for today and Thursday and maybe Monday next week. All right, so we'll stop the video there.